Welcome to 12 Worst Cars of the 1960s. The 1960s brought us some iconic rides, but not every car was a classic. From mechanical nightmares to design flops, these are the ones history tried to forget. Stick around because the worst one will leave you speechless. First, 1965 Simca. French cars are known for their quirky charm, but the 1965 Simca took that a little too far. On paper, it seemed like a solid idea, an affordable, practical car for the everyday driver. But in reality, it was a mechanical headache. The biggest issue? Reliability. Simca's engines had a habit of overheating, leaking oil, or just giving up entirely at the worst possible moments. And if you were lucky enough to keep it running, you had to deal with a questionable braking system that made stopping feel more like a suggestion than a guarantee. Then there was the rust problem. Simca bodies seemed to disintegrate faster than other cars of the era. If you lived in a humid or rainy climate, chances were your Simca was already rusting in the showroom. The only saving grace was that it was cheap, but as many owners quickly realized, that low price came with a high cost and frustration. But if you thought the Simca was bad, wait until you hear about a British luxury car that couldn't decide if it wanted to be posh or a complete disaster. 2. 1967 Humber Snipe. If the name Humber Snipe sounds like a fancy British luxury car, that's because it was supposed to be. Humber had a reputation for making stately vehicles fit for diplomats and the upper class. But the 1967 Snipe? It was less of a noble steed and more of a lumbering embarrassment. For starters, it was massive, long, heavy, and incredibly awkward to drive. The handling was sluggish, making tight turns feels like maneuvering a boat through a narrow canal. The Snipe's underpowered engine struggled to haul its own weight, makes it feel like a lifetime achievement when you could get it moving. Then there was the build quality. While it looked posh from the outside, the interior materials were cheap and flimsy. The electrical system had a mind of its own, leading to flickering lights and mysterious power failures that left drivers stranded. And let's not forget the gas mileage. Owning a Humber Snipe meant spending more time at the fuel pump than actually enjoying the drive. The thirsty engine guzzled gas at an alarming rate, a real problem during the fuel-conscious late 60s. What if I tell you now that the Humber Snipe is not as bad a car compared to the Vauxhall tried to blend British sensibility with American muscle when it introduced the 1968 Ventora? On paper, it sounded great, a mid-size sedan with a bigger, more powerful engine than its standard siblings. But in reality, it was like a wannabe bodybuilder who skipped leg day. Vauxhall decided to shove a 3.3-litre inline-6 engine under the hood, which should have made the Ventora a proper highway cruiser. But instead of delivering smooth power, the engine felt sluggish and unrefined. Paired with an outdated suspension system, the handling felt like a wobbly shopping cart. Let's talk about reliability, or rather, the lack of it. The Ventora quickly gained a reputation for electrical failures, rust issues, and mechanical breakdowns. You never knew if the car would start in the morning, and if it did, you weren't sure if you'd make it back in time for dinner. Vauxhall wanted to make a car that would propel them into the future, but it ended up being a complete disappointment. But you know what won't be a disappointment? This channel. Subscribe for more forgotten automotive disasters just like the 1964 Peel Trident. If you ever wanted to drive a car that looked like it belonged in a sci-fi B-movie, the Peel Trident was your answer. But while this tiny bubble car may have looked futuristic, it drove like a glorified go-kart, and not in a fun way. Manufactured by the Peel Engineering Company, the Trident was marketed as the car of the future. That future, however, seemed to involve zero legroom, questionable safety, and an engine that struggled to outrun a bicycle. Just imagine you are in a car, and you are in a race with someone riding a bicycle, and you cannot outrun them. The car came equipped with a 49 cubic centimeter scooter engine, meaning its top speed was around 30 miles per hour on a good day, and that's if you weren't going uphill. Inside, things were even more ridiculous. Peel claimed it could fit 2 adults, but unless those adults were willing to sit shoulder to shoulder like sardines in a can, they sure as hell wouldn't fit. Safety was genuinely laughable. The Peel Trident had no crumple zones, no airbags, and no real protection if you got into an accident. If you get hit by another car, you would prefer to have been inside a plastic hamster ball than the Peel Trident. As a result, it faded into obscurity, only to be remembered as one of the strangest and most impractical vehicles ever made. But if you think the Peel Trident was slow, just wait until we talk about the car that took slow to a whole different level. Number 5, 1965, Renault Dauphine. If patience is a virtue, then Renault Dauphine owners must have been saints, because driving this car required the patience of a monk stuck in rush hour traffic. Under the hood, you'd find a ridiculous 32 horsepower engine. To put that in perspective, a modern lawnmower has nearly half that power, and at least it doesn't have to carry 4 passengers and a trunk full of groceries. Renault optimistically claimed the Dauphine could hit a top speed of 70 miles per hour, but in reality, you'd need a long downhill slope, a tailwind, and divine intervention to reach those speeds. Getting from 0 to 60 took over 30 seconds, which means it had the same acceleration as a sloth climbing a tree. And let's talk about reliability, or rather the lack of it. The Dauphine had notoriously poor rust proofing, so if you parked it outside for too long, there was a good chance it would slowly dissolve into a pile of corroded metal. Add in electrical issues, overheating problems, and a transmission that was about as smooth as gravel, and you had a recipe for disaster. Despite all of this, Renault somehow managed to sell millions of these things. While Renault somehow managed to succeed in the sales department, the next car maker was not so lucky. 6. 1960. MGA Twin Cam. Imagine saving up your hard-earned cash in 1960 to buy a sleek, sporty British roadster, only to find out that your brand new car spent more time in the repair shop than on the road. On paper, this car sounded fantastic. MG took their beloved MGA Roadster and stuffed a high-performance 1.6-litre twin-cam engine, promising more power, higher revs, and a true race-inspired driving experience. In theory, it should have been a game-changer. In reality, it was a disaster. The twin-cam engine was an absolute nightmare to maintain. It had a nasty habit of overheating, burning too much oil, and spontaneously self-destructing. Pistons would seize, the engine would knock, and in some cases the car would just quit running altogether, because why bother functioning when you can just give up? Then there was the fuel system. The car came with SU carburetors, which were supposed to be sophisticated, but instead acted like moody teenagers, sometimes working, sometimes not, and always in need of attention. If you were lucky, the car would start. If you weren't, well, better start pushing. Handling wasn't much better. MG's engineers thought it was a good idea to use knockoff wire wheels, which had a tendency to come loose at high speeds. That's right, you could be cruising down the highway, hit a bump, and suddenly watch one of your wheels roll away like it had better things to do. And let's not forget the brakes. MG decided to fit Dunlop disc brakes to improve stopping power, which sounds great, except these brakes were so finicky and fragile that they would either fail completely or grab too hard, sending you into an unintended spin. The car was so bad that MG had to cut production after just 2 years and replace it with a more reliable, lower performance engine. But if you think MG's mistake was terrible, just wait until you hear about how Volkswagen wanted to make everyone forget they made the 411. 7. 1968. Volkswagen 411. By the late 1960s, Volkswagen had built a reputation for making small, reliable, and quirky cars. The Beetle was a smash hit, the microbus was a hippie icon, and VW was riding high. But then, they introduced the 411. Oh boy! First off, let's talk about the design. The 411 looked like someone took a Beetle, stretched it out awkwardly, and then forgot to add any actual style. It had a weirdly high stance, a bulbous rear end, and headlights that always looked like they were surprised to see you. Then there was the performance, or rather, the lack of it. The car was powered by a 1.7-litre air-cooled engine, but thanks to its heavier body, it was slower than a confused turtle. You'd prefer to ride a Harry Potter's Quidditch broom than the 411. Acceleration was painfully sluggish, and if you ever needed to pass someone, you basically had to send a prayer to the automotive gods and hope for the best. Handling? Forget about it. The rear-engine, rear-wheel drive layout made it tail-happy in corners, and if you didn't respect its unpredictable nature, you'd find yourself in a ditch before you could say Volkswagen reliability. And the cherry on top, the automatic transmission. VW offered an optional Sportomatic gearbox, which was neither sporty nor automatic. It was clunky, slow, and so frustrating that many owners gave up and just walked instead. If you think all the cars so far are bad, wait till you see what's next. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. 8. 1966 Saab Sonett II. Saab built its reputation on making quirky, practical cars that could survive the brutal Scandinavian winters. But in the 1960s, they decided to step outside their comfort zone and try something sporty. Enter the Saab Sonett II, a car that looked fast, sounded fast, but absolutely was not fast. Saab, for some reason, decided to stuff a 3-cylinder, 2-stroke engine under the hood. Now, in theory, this could have worked if they had made it more powerful, but instead, they gave it just 60 horsepower. With such a tiny engine, you'd think the Sonett II would at least be light and nimble, right? Nope. Thanks to Saab's love for over-engineering, it ended up being weirdly heavy for its size. So instead of zooming down the road like a proper sports car, it just sort of wheezed along like an asthmatic hamster. The design wasn't anything to write home about. The long, sloping front end gave it an awkward, squished appearance, and the pop-up headlights looked more like googly eyes glued onto a bad Halloween costume. But the real kicker? The 2-stroke engine needed oil to be mixed with the fuel manually, like how you would do it in the Stone Age. So every time you filled up the Sonett II, you had to measure out oil and mix it yourself. It was so bad that Saab quickly abandoned the idea of making fast cars altogether. Come to think of it, the next car on the list makes the Sonett II a good car. 9. 1962 Ford Taunus 12M. Ford's German division had big dreams when designing the Taunus 12M. They wanted a modern, stylish, and forward-thinking car, but instead they created a rolling disaster. First off, Ford decided to go with a weird, bulbous shape that made the car look like a turtle that had just been stepped on. It wasn't just ugly, it was confusingly ugly. But the real nightmare was under the hood. Ford thought it would be a genius idea to use a water-cooled V4 engine, but this thing was so rough and unrefined that it felt like you had a tiny earthquake happening in the car at all times. Vibrations were so bad that parts of the car literally shook loose. Then came the reliability issues. The engine overheated constantly. It felt like you were driving close to the sun. Also, the transmission was prone to failure, and the brakes were about as effective as blowing on the tires. Owners quickly learned that driving a 12M meant carrying a toolkit at all times because you'd probably need it just to get home. The car ended up becoming one of Ford's worst decisions ever. And speaking of bad decisions, let's talk about how the next car on the list tried to be a Japanese BMW. 10. 1966 Hino Contessa. Hino had a dream, a big dream. They wanted to create Japan's answer to BMW, one that will impress the elite. But once you actually try to drive a 1966 Hino Contessa, you just know you have made the wrongest decision of your entire life. First, let's talk about the engine placement. Hino thought it would be cool to put the engine in the back. The problem? This little 1.3-liter 4-cylinder engine had no business being back there. It threw off the weight balance so badly that the rear end felt like it had a mind of its own, making tight turns feel like you were about to launch into another dimension. Then came the handling. Because of its rear-heavy setup, the Contessa was known for spinning out unpredictably. Owners quickly realized that driving this car in the rain was like trying to walk on ice while wearing banana peels for shoes. Many people also complained of electrical failures, cheap interior materials, and body panels that rusted faster than a sandwich left out in the rain. When Toyota acquired Hino in 1967, they basically took one look at the Contessa and said, yeah, we're not doing this. Coming up next is a small car that had very big problems. 11. 1963 Hillman Imp. The Hillman Imp's rear-mounted aluminum engine sounded like a smart ID, as it was light, efficient, and ahead of its time. But in practice, it overheated like a kettle left on the stove for too long. The cooling system was so badly designed that many Imps just gave up mid-drive, leaving their owners stranded on the side of the road. The throttle cables snapped, the gearboxes were temperamental, and the electrics had more mood swings than a soap opera character. If you owned an Imp, you basically had to carry a toolbox wherever you went, because chances were you'd need it. But perhaps the worst part was the production problems. The Imp was built in a brand new factory in Scotland, where workers had no prior experience in car manufacturing. As a result, quality control was non-existent, so much so that some imps left the factory with missing parts. Last on the list is the 1965 AMC Marlin. In the mid-1960s, muscle cars and fastback designs were all the rage. Ford had the Mustang, Dodge had the Charger, and AMC, well, they had the Marlin, a car that was supposed to be sporty, but ended up being a giant, sluggish whale of a thing. First of all, the design was just off. It looked ancient right from the factory floor. The performance wasn't great either. Even with an optional V8 engine, it felt like it was hauling bricks. Acceleration was slow, and the handling was about as precise as steering a bathtub down a water slide. The Marlin was AMC's attempt to compete with the Mustang and Charger, but instead, it sank without a trace. By 1967, AMC pulled the plug, and the Marlin was gone, forgotten, and buried under the weight of its own bad decisions. And there you have it, 12 of the worst cars of the 1960s, which left owners frustrated, mechanics busy, and automakers wishing they could hit the undo button. Which of these disasters shock you the most? Drop it in the comments below.